Serial killer facts that will haunt your nightmares, part 3. Serial killer Robert Pickton would grind up the bodies of his victims in the same processor he used for his pigs, meaning that town locals regularly consumed human meat. Ted Bundy, one of the most infamous killers of all time, worked at a suicide hotline. Jeffrey Dahmer didn't kill or eat people with tattoos because, as he says, it gave the flesh a weird taste. When serial killer Ed Gein was arrested, police searched his home to find a bag of wilted vaginas, a lampshade made out of a human face, and a half-finished woman suit, made entirely out of human skin. Serial killer Robert Hansen abducted his victims and flew them to an isolated cabin in the Alaskan mountains. He then released them into the forest and hunted them with a knife and rifle.
This is the Pale Lady. She is a portly woman with long black hair, jet black eyes, and frighteningly pale skin. The most notorious story about her revolves around a dream that an artist named Lucy Morgan once had. She had planned to visit the village of Kingston, but decided against it after having a bad dream the night before. In the dream, she walked up a curved staircase and entered a dark bedroom. The floor was made up of trapdoor-style tiles and the windows were nailed shut. Lucy went to sleep in her dream and awoke to see the Pale Lady leaning over her. She whispered, "This is an evil place. Flee while you can." Lucy woke up and decided that maybe visiting Kingston was a bad idea. She instead visited Dorset after a recommendation from a landlady. When she arrived at a guest house, she noticed the same staircase, floor tiles, and windows as she'd seen in her dream. The owner of the guest house later brought up some tea. When Lucy opened the door to greet her, she realised it wasn't the landlady at all. It was the Pale Lady.
While it may appear ordinary, this might just be the scariest Twitter page of all time. The username Hanging Pro refers to the man behind the avatar with a noose around its neck, Takahiro Shiraishi, aka the Twitter Killer. Over the course of 3 months in 2017, he murdered and sexually abused 9 people, most of which were young girls that he'd met on social media. Takahiro used Twitter to lure suicidal women into his home, claiming that he would help them die. However, when he met up with his victims in public, he would tranquilize the women and carry them back to his apartment where he would strangle them and dispose of their bodies. When Takahiro was captured and taken to court, his lawyers argued that the deaths were consensual because the victims had technically agreed to be killed. However, the court disagreed and sentenced him to death for his crimes, claiming they were sadistically and sexually charged and there was no true consent ever given.
The creator of Cash App was stabbed to death and his murderer is still out there. Last Tuesday, 43-year-old Bob Lee was stabbed outside an apartment building in downtown San Francisco. Bob managed to call police at 2:35 a.m. and pleaded for help after being stabbed twice in the chest. A few minutes later, he was found by police with life-threatening stab wounds and was rushed to the hospital where he later died from his injuries. It's been said that the attack may have been random, but it's still too early to confirm that. Even though surveillance footage did not capture Bob being stabbed, you can still see him pressing down on his stab wound and approaching a driver for help, but the driver just drives off. Now, surveillance footage captured someone suspicious wearing all black, wheeling a suitcase a block away from where Bob was stabbed only 1 minute after the attack. This person is not considered a suspect, but they are still looking into it. What's sad is that Bob actually moved from San Francisco to Miami with his family because he wanted to get away from all this crime and danger in the city.
This is another terrifying urban legend that ended up being true, and I'm putting my Halloween frames on for this one. Back in the 90s, there was a legend in Mall, Switzerland that there was a creature lurking in the woods. He looked like a man, but he had a long black cape, gas mask, and was over 6 feet tall. At first, it was only the children who talked about seeing him in the woods, so all of the adults kind of just thought it was a legend, but then some of the parents started seeing him. One woman was just out for a walk with her child when she said that she saw him lurking in the woods looking at her. But one day, a photographer was out walking in the woods when he captured this photo. This is the only known photo of the creature in existence, a creature which they called Le Loyon. That photo goes viral, and afterwards, a woman walking through the woods finds a box with the gas mask and the cloak in it. There was also a note in the box from Le Loyon. And get this, he explains that he's not a monster. He was just an old hermit who would dress up to take mental health walks. And now there was so much attention on him, he was hanging up his cloak for good. You might not want Le Loyon's outfit, but if you want mine, you can use my code HEART15 for 15% off your first order with Pair Eyewear.
This professor was just arrested for the possession of CP or CSAM, and if charges are officially filed, that will make him a pedophile professor. Meet James Andy Chang. So just yesterday, he was arrested on the University of Houston campus. Now, I live here in Houston, Texas, so this is kind of a local story for me, but if you don't know, the University of Houston is huge. There's over 45,000 students enrolled, and a number of them were taking mathematics classes from, you guessed it, James Andy Chang. Now, on campus, James was actually known by a number of people to be a very well-respected lecturer and a funny professor who was cracking jokes in class. But that all changed yesterday when he was arrested and brought in for questioning. Now, James hasn't been officially charged yet. They just arrested him on suspicion of the possession of CSAM or CP. But immediately, the university took action and suspended him. And he also works as a tutor here in Houston. Now, I really hope that he wasn't using that tutoring service to get close to young kids, but you never know with these sorts of people. Like I said before, I actually live here in Houston, so this story hits pretty close to home, but if there are any developments in this case, like when he gets charged and with what he gets charged, I'll be sure to update you guys here on TikTok.
This man found revenge after his family passed away from a plane crash. In 2002, Vitaly Koloyev bought tickets for his wife and 2 kids to come visit him from Russia to Spain, where he worked after being apart for so long. Only a few hours into the flight, a DHL cargo plane crashed into their plane, causing his family and everyone else on that flight to lose their lives. Obviously, Vitaly was devastated. His kids, who were only 10 and 4 years old, were his life. He spent a lot of time trying to understand what went wrong and how did these 2 planes collide. He then learned that Peter Nelson, the air traffic controller who was working that night and monitoring that flight, might have been negligent. Peter was apparently monitoring multiple screens and flights on that night when he should have been just focusing on one. However, he did see the 2 planes traveling towards each other, and he did mention it to the pilots attempting to avoid the crash, but it was still unsuccessful. Vitaly blamed Peter for his family's death, and 2 years later, he tracked him down in Switzerland and took his life. Vitaly said that his intentions were to talk to Peter first, but things escalated, and so he stabbed him in the stomach in his home in front of his children. Vitaly was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Apparently, he only served like 2, but while he was in there, all the inmates looked up to him for taking Peter's life. Crazy, huh? And to this day, Vitaly does not regret doing what he did.
Neighbours saw a couple arguing in the street. They had no idea the horrors that were about to unfold. Heather Stamper was a 31-year-old woman living in Delaware City. Her boyfriend Stephen Pierce was 45 years old. On the 9th of July 2016, Stephen thought that he saw Heather texting her ex-boyfriend. The pair ended up getting into a really big argument about this, and Heather wasn't happy. Witnesses saw them arguing with each other in the middle of the street. Heather ended up breaking up with Stephen that night as a result of this. In a jealous rage, Stephen went to one of his friend's house and asked if he could borrow a gun. The friend declined and was really concerned when they saw Stephen ripping the seat covers off his car. He was also reportedly shouting that he wanted to kill Heather. Stephen then decided to try his luck with a different friend and again ask him for a gun. Witnesses also reported hearing Stephen saying, "This is my last night of freedom. I'm going to be a lifer come tomorrow." He then returned to Heather's house and was let in by her roommate. The roommate heard loud noises coming from Heather's room, and 15 minutes later, Stephen left the room crying. He told the roommate that he would never see her again. Little did the roommate know, Heather was lying dead on the floor of her bedroom. Stephen actually returned to the scene of the crime the next day and pretended that he'd just found Heather dead. He called 911 and her cause of death was ruled as blunt force trauma. Stephen was eventually found guilty of first-degree murder and was given life in prison plus 25 years.
29-year-old Gemma McCluskey was senselessly murdered during a petty argument over an overflowing bath. Her murderer was her own brother. Quick trigger warning, the aftermath of her death is pretty graphic. Gemma was an actress living in East London with her brother Tony. She was best known for her role in EastEnders as Kerry Skinner. Tony was extremely abusive towards Gemma, regularly dishing out beatings while high on cannabis. Gemma would often wear dark sunglasses to hide her black eyes, and this abuse had been going on for 20 years. On the night of March 1st, 2012, Gemma and Tony had got into an argument after Tony flooded the bathroom. He left the bathroom taps on, and it was the last straw for Gemma, and she'd asked him to move out. Tony flew into a rage and beat Gemma to death in their own home. Sickeningly, the day after the murder, Tony had actually sent Gemma a text saying "love ya" before dismembering her body, stuffing it into a suitcase, loading it into a taxi, and then dumping it in Regent's Canal in Hackney. A search party was launched, and on March 6th, Gemma's torso was found in the canal, and her limbs were found in bin bags. Gemma's head wasn't actually found for another 6 months. Gemma's friends told police that on the day that she went missing, they'd overheard her on the phone arguing with Tony. Tony was questioned, and it wasn't long before he admitted the murder. He said that they'd been arguing, and he grabbed her by the wrists and punched her to the floor, but couldn't remember anything else. Gemma's cause of death was blunt force trauma after several blows to the head. Tony admitted to manslaughter but denied murder, citing a loss of control. 10 months later, in January 2013, he was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life with a minimum of 20 years. Nowhere near long enough, in my opinion.
Corn star August Ames took her own life after the backlash she received after posting a single tweet. Let's take a look at this tragic story. So August was actually born as Mercedes Grabowski in the year 1994. And her life story is actually really sad. So both of her parents were in the military, they traveled a lot while she was younger, and later on in her life she would allege that her own grandfather would molest her when she was younger. She told her parents about it, but they didn't believe her, so they sent her to live in a group home when she was only 12 years old. Eventually, though, in 2013, when she was 19 years old, she entered the adult industry. And immediately she was a massive success in the industry. She has over 100 credits for films she appeared in, she won awards, and it seemed like her career was going really well. Well, until she posted this tweet. I'm just going to let you pause and read this, but basically she was stating that she canceled her shoot the next day because the guy she was going to be performing with had appeared in gay porn. So obviously this was a controversial thing to post, and some communities viewed this as a homophobic tweet and immediately began to bash her on social media. She clapped back a number of times, but then the death threats started pouring in, and there were hundreds of them. People were even posting things like this and then deleting them after she died. So she was actually married to an adult film producer and director, but even being in a stable relationship couldn't save August. And just 2 days after she made that initial tweet, her body was found in a park in California. She had taken her own life in public by hanging. A toxicology report revealed that she had a number of illicit substances in her body at the time of her death, but people have obviously attributed this tragic death to the cyberbullying that she endured. And this whole thing opened up a whole line of discussion about internet bullying, how far it can go, and the consequences of these things.
The disappearance of this schoolgirl seemed like an isolated case until a terrifying development. On the morning of the 13th of February 2009, Amber Dubois vanished on her way to school. At the time she was 14 years old and was heading to her high school in California. At 7:10 a.m, some parents reported having seen her walking to school, but at 7:30 she never showed up. She was reported missing that day. That same evening, her mum was desperately trying to think of ways that they could get hold of her or find out where she was. Her mum called her mobile phone provider and got them to reset her password for her voicemail to allow her to access the voicemail. Bizarrely, the next day, Amber's phone was turned on for around 30 seconds. Whoever was accessing it tried to go to voicemail but couldn't, and it was then immediately turned off. Police initially focused the investigation on the mum's boyfriend, Dave Cave. Amber and Dave were known to not get on very well, but Dave denied any involvement. The strain of the investigation and the doubts caused Amber's mum to eventually break up with Dave. Then, the following February, another girl went missing. This time it was 17-year-old Chelsea King, who vanished from the same area. Chelsea had been on a run just 10 miles away from where Amber had vanished. Police scoured the area and disturbingly they found her socks and underwear. The socks were sent off for DNA testing and they found a match. This was registered S offender John Gardner. Police then announced that Chelsea's body was found in a shallow grave nearby. John was charged with R and murder. He was also charged with attempted R of another woman at Lake Hodges months prior to Chelsea's murder. Initially, John denied being involved in Amber's disappearance, but eventually he did confess to knowing where her body was. He took police to a remote area in San Diego where the teenager was buried. He was obviously charged then with Amber's murder too. In court, he admitted the killings. In relation to Amber's death, he said that he was upset about some personal things going on in his life and went out that morning hunting for a victim. He said that he pulled up beside the girl and threatened her with a knife to get her in the car. He was sentenced to life plus 25 years for the attempted R.
When asked why they want the gas again, they simply said, "I must remain awake." They were placed back inside the chamber, and when asked, "What are you?" one of them said, "We are you. We are what you hide from in your beds every night."
If you've seen The Good Nurse on Netflix, then you'll know exactly who this case is about. Charles Cullen. Charles went on a massive murder spree for around 15 years, killing what's thought to be hundreds of people. He's since confessed to a lot of these murders, but says that he has no memory of many more, so it's absolutely impossible to know how many he's actually killed. So the big question here is, how did Charles have access to that many people in order to murder them without anyone realising? Charles had a fairly rough upbringing. His father died when he was a baby, and then he lost his mother while he was in high school. He had many failed suicide attempts, and eventually he enlisted in the United States Navy. Charles's behaviour led to him being committed to the Navy psychiatric ward multiple times, and he eventually received a medical discharge. This is where his career took a turn, and in 1984, he enrolled as a nurse in New Jersey. His newfound nursing position obviously gave him access to lots of vulnerable people. Charles soon started abusing his position of trust and began administering lethal doses of IV medication to his patients. He lasted 4 years at his first position at St Barnabas Hospital and murdered multiple patients with overdoses of insulin. Hospital authorities actually became suspicious when they started investigating contaminated IV bags, and Charles was forced to move on to a new hospital. He took a job at Warren Hospital in New Jersey, where he murdered 3 elderly patients with overdoses of heart medication. One of these patients had actually described Charles as that sneaky nurse and told other staff members that he'd injected her while she'd been asleep. Charles, fearing that he was about to get found out, of course moved on again and began a 5-year stint at a new hospital in New Jersey. He took a position in intensive care and ended up murdering another 5 people with heart medication. Charles then moved between multiple facilities between 1998 and 2003, murdering many more patients along the way. But when one patient died of low blood sugar, hospital staff alerted New Jersey police, and that would be Charles's last victim. Police looked into Charles's employment history and found that there'd been many suspicions over his involvement in patient deaths. They kept him under investigation and actually assigned another nurse to visit him after work hours wearing a wire. This produced enough evidence for the police to arrest him. Charles was initially only charged with 1 murder and 1 attempted murder, but he soon confessed to many more, and the true horror of his crimes came to light. Charles admitted to the murders of over 40 patients, but said that he often blacked out and had no memory of many others. When the police compared Charles's employment history to the multiple deaths that had occurred at the facilities he'd been working at, they realised that his victims were probably in the hundreds. On March 2nd, 2006, Charles Cullen was sentenced to 11 consecutive life sentences, meaning he won't be eligible for parole until 2403. At his sentencing, Charles became really uncooperative, chanting at the judge, and had to be gagged with duct tape and restrained. He's currently incarcerated at the New Jersey State Prison in Trenton, New Jersey.
This little girl got revenge on her killer from beyond the grave. On the 25th of January 2005, Katie Coleman finished school and went back to her home in Indiana, United States. Katie was 10 years old and lived with her mum and dad and sister. At 3 p.m. that day, her mum asked her to go to the dollar store to get toilet roll. Now, Katie knew the area well and it wasn't really far to go. After getting the toilet roll from the shop, Katie stopped at the bank to get a lollipop for her way home. However, when Katie's dad returned home, the little girl still wasn't back. Her parents called police and a few days later an Amber Alert was issued. A witness came forward to say that they'd seen a girl who looked like Katie in a truck. The driver was described as a skinny white man about 6 feet tall with short dark hair and fair complexion. Tragically, 5 days after going missing, Katie's body was found. It was in a creek just a few miles from her home. Disturbingly, her hands and feet were tied and she had been SA'd. It was determined that her cause of death had been drowning. 20-year-old Charles Hickman rang the police to confess. He said he and another man had abducted Katie after she'd witnessed a substance deal. He said they tried to scare her into not saying anything and they tied her up, but she ended up falling in and drowning. Disgustingly, this turned out to be a false confession. This obviously wasted police time and caused massive amounts of distress to Katie's family. Police continued to look for evidence and they did find a cigarette butt near to Katie's body. They tested it for DNA and it matched a man called Anthony Stockelman. Police compared the DNA on the cigarette butt to the DNA on Katie's body and it was a match. Anthony, a father of 2 young boys, was in the area that day visiting his mother. He entered a guilty plea and was given life in prison without parole. But this is not the only punishment that Anthony would receive. Now, Anthony claims that he was under the influence of extreme mental or emotional disturbance during the crime. He said this is because his father had died 6 months prior. Regardless, Anthony was imprisoned. Unlucky for Anthony, he was actually housed in a prison with Katie's cousin. Jared Harris was serving a sentence for burglary and was in the same wing as Anthony. Jared forcibly tattooed the words "Katie's Revenge" across Anthony's forehead. He wanted to brand Anthony for life for killing his young cousin.
What? Nothing there, mate. Nothing there. What? There's nothing there.
This killer accidentally admitted to his crimes by accident when he forgot he was wearing a microphone while taking part in a documentary. This is how a true crime documentary exposed a killer. In 1971, Robert Durst met Kathleen McCormack and they got married. At the time of her disappearance in 1982, Kathleen had nearly graduated college. She was last seen by a witness at a dinner party where she appeared to be upset. She got a call from Robert and left. Robert admitted to having argued with Kathleen that night, but he said he put her on a train to New York and then never saw her again. Her friend called police to report her missing. Interestingly, Kathleen had been treated at a medical centre for facial bruises weeks prior to this and told the friend that Robert had done it. Robert had actually been dating someone else for some time prior to this and had been living separately to Kathleen. When her family broke into her cottage to try and find out where she was, they found the place had been trashed and her possessions put in the bin. Kathleen's family always believed that Robert was involved in her disappearance. In 2000, Susan Berman, a friend of Robert's, was found murdered. Now, she'd actually provided Robert with an alibi for Kathleen's disappearance. Now, pay really close attention to this next bit. Days after she was killed, a letter addressed to the Beverly Hills Police Department contained Susan's address and the word cadaver on it. On the envelope, Beverly was misspelled. Robert admitted in 2005 that Susan had called him shortly before her death to say that the police wanted to question her about Kathleen going missing. It's believed that Robert killed Susan to keep her quiet. In 2001, Robert's neighbour's body parts were found floating in Galveston Bay. Robert's elderly neighbour, Morris Black, had been killed and Robert was arrested. He was actually released on bail and fled and was found about a month later in Pennsylvania. He was found with $37,000 cash, 2 weapons, and interestingly, Morris Black's driving licence. In court, Robert claimed he was acting in self-defence. He said he'd accidentally shot Morris and dismembered his body. Due to lack of forensics, he only got 5 years in jail. This is where things get really crazy. HBO was filming a documentary called The Jinx. During production, Susan's stepson found a letter written by Robert. This contained the same spelling error in the word Beverly as the anonymous letter to police. This implicated Robert in the murder. Now, while filming the documentary, Robert needed the toilet. He forgot that he had a microphone still attached to him. He was recorded talking to himself. He said, "There it is, you're caught. You're right, of course, but you can't imagine. Arrest him." And then he said, "What a disaster. He was right. I was wrong." And finally he said, "I'm having difficulty with the question. What the hell did I do? Killed them all, of course." Family of this missing girl found out via the media that she'd been murdered, butchered, and sold as kebab meat. This case will put you off ever eating a kebab again. Charlene Downs disappeared aged just 14 years old in November 2003. She was living in Blackpool, UK, and was last seen in an area containing many kebab shops and takeaways. While out with her friends one night, Charlene bumped into her mum. Her mum said that Charlene needed to be home by 10 p.m. that night, which was quite typical for Charlene. Tragically, this would be the last time that her mum would ever see Charlene alive. When Charlene didn't turn up by 10 p.m, her dad went out on his bike looking for her for around half an hour. When he couldn't find her, he just presumed that she'd stayed over at her friend's house and went home and went to sleep. When she still didn't arrive the next morning, her parents started to get worried and they called police. Police, however, said that they could not report this as a missing person until she'd been missing for 48 hours. Eventually, police did start to look for her, but they said that they presumed she was a runaway. The case went cold until 3 years later. Charlene's family were called into a police station. There was news of 2 men who had been arrested, linked with a local takeaway called Funny Boys. They were arrested on suspicion of murder and disposal of Charlene. This is when the family found out some shocking news via the media about what had happened to Charlene. An article published stated that she had been grinded up and sold as kebab meat. One of the brothers of the men who had been arrested had heard them bragging about doing this. Now, Charlene's disappearance actually unearthed the fact that these takeaways were being used as a front for P rings, where men were luring teenagers in with food and alcohol in exchange for things I cannot repeat on this app. When the case against these 2 men went to trial, the jury failed to reach a verdict. The case was then thrown out of court due to apparent lack of physical evidence. One of the reasons for this is how well Charlene's body had obviously been disposed of. Both men who had been charged were given a £250,000 compensation for being falsely trialled. Around a week after the trial, Charlene's mum was actually arrested for stabbing her husband. He declined to press charges, saying that he knew she had been stressed. Members of the family were also charged with racially aggravated assault against the brother of the man who'd been charged with murder, and also punching the man who'd been charged with helping dispose of her body. In August 2017, police arrested a 51-year-old man who lived in Blackpool at the time of Charlene's disappearance. This was on suspicion of murdering her, however, he was released just 2 days later. We still have no justice for Charlene and nobody is behind bars for her killing.